right, I'm going to be talking to you for the next few minutes about GDPR compliant APIs. My name is Travis Spencer. I'm the CEO of Curity. I'm also the founder of Nordic APIs. And I'm going to be looking not only at GDPR, but also creating privacy-related security measures for your APIs in general. So even if you're not affected by this regulation, I'll give you a lot of tips and a lot of advice on how you can create secure and private APIs. In particular, I'm going to talk to you about 3 techniques. I'm going to talk to you about interactive user consent. I'm going to talk to you about something called PPID, or Pairwise Pseudonymous Identifiers. I'm going to talk to you about phantom tokens. So that's what we're going to discuss over these next 20 minutes or so. First of all, I want to talk about interactive user consent. This is the sort of OK that the user is going to give the client application or the authorization in OAuth. This is going to be the case where the user is going to request access at some sort of mobile app or some sort of website. The user will log in, and then they'll get to this part, which is consent. Do you allow this third-party application to do things on your behalf? People call this authorization. I call it delegation. But whatever you call it, that's the part that we're going to talk about. And what I want to talk in particular about and focus on is how to create a usable interactive user consent dialogue. How do you actually, what are the requirements of creating a good user consent? Because this is important in GDPR, where you have to have the user opt in to things. So that's the relation to GDPR. Okay? So when building interactive user consent, you need to show what client application the user is consenting to. So you want to give information like the relationship of the organization to this application. So maybe it's a first-party application, like one that you've built or a trusted partner has built, or maybe it's a third-party application that you have no relationship to. So I think it's important during that consent moment to inform the user, like this is a application that we have maybe an arm's length relationship with, or a very nominal relationship with. You also want to present the client name. So the client name could be some sort of human readable name. But it could also be a client identifier. If it's the identifier, it's probably going to be less understandable to the user. So having a name will be important that the human can make sense of. Having some sort of logo that could inform the user graphically on which application or organization they're actually consenting to have rights to their data. Giving some sort of description of the application is also important, so they can know, like, yeah, this is the application I think I'm consenting to. Okay, does that make sense? In addition to showing client information, you want to show the user information. So remember back, you saw the request for access, you saw login, and then you see consent. So the login part might have been really fast. Maybe they didn't see it. Maybe single sign-on kicked in at the authentication service, and this is the first dialogue they're seeing. So it's important to show the user which account they're logged in with, because it might not be the one that they expect to be logged in with. They might consent to show data of a different persona that they don't want to, so they might want to log out and switch accounts. So it's important to show the user information during that consent. Also, another important thing in the consent moment is you want to consent to claims, not scopes. So what are scopes in OAuth and OpenID Connect? Scopes are groups of claims. Claims are information asserted by one party about another. So the one who is asserting this information in this case is the OpenID Connect provider. And what it's asserting is data about the user. And the application is asking for different data to be released. And it's doing that very often by asking for scopes or scope of access. So what you need to make sure and do is ask the user for those different claims, because one scope will map into many claims. So for example, this is an OpenID Connect request where all the application asked for was the email scope, and that's 2 claims, verified email and email. And the other scope that it asked for was OpenID, which allows for access to the user ID. So it's important to present the user with a consent screen where they can authorize access to their claims or their attributes. It's also important to remember the default scope. So in OAuth and OpenID Connect, we have this idea of a default scope, and if the application is asking for access to that, we need to present that in a sensible way because there won't be any claims except for the default one. So here we need to present the user with a way of saying that the application is asking for access. Very often on these consent screens, you may have the option to remove certain claims that the application has requested. So sometimes deselection of those claims will actually break the application. So very often it's not possible to remove consent. Like if you don't consent, it's all or nothing. So the application will get access to all of that data, or the user will cancel and prevent the application from having that access. So a lot of times in your consent screens, you'll want to mark those as required. Sometimes, though, they will be deselectable, and the user will be able to say, yeah, you can have access to my email, but not my verified one, and you can have access to my user ID. So you want to have the option to deselect that, and the deselection, which should be based on the OAuth client or the OpenID Connect client, or on the runtime behavior. So you might be able to provide a query string argument of prompt equals consent allow deselection, and then the user will be able to deselect that. So the application could know, like, for these ones, I won't break, so the user can opt in or opt out of those things. You can also, in OpenID Connect, specify in the claims parameter that certain claims are required. So maybe deselection is allowed for all of them, but I've got to have this one claim. So if the user says no to that, all bets are off, so they may as well just cancel everything. Okay, so you want to allow for consent to certain claims, and you want to have claims be required or not required based on configuration or based on runtime. Make sense? If you're asking for a large amount of claims, first of all, you probably shouldn't be. But if you are, you want to make that possible to not overwhelm the user, because like we talked about, there's a lot of other information on this page about the client, about the user, that they're logged in as, other things like that. So if you have this big list of claims, they might miss those other details. So it's important, first of all, to present that in a smaller, compact form, but then allow the user to see everything that they're consenting to. Another way to do this in a more progressive way is to ask for one scope or a couple of claims, and then as they start doing different things, redirect back over to the OpenID Connect server saying, now I need this claim. And if the user is still logged in, they won't have to log in anew. They'll just be presented with this screen with a couple more claims, so you can sort of step up the permission that's being delegated. Another important thing is to make sure that the claim names and the descriptions are localized. So here's a similar screenshot than the previous slides, but in Swedish. And the way that you can localize this are many, but you need to do it. One way that you could do it is by using the UI locales query string parameter that's defined in OpenID Connect, where you can provide the locale, and then the OpenID Connect server's consent screen can react to that and see, like, okay, now the user is asking for Swedish. And what it might do one reason it might do that is that the application has saved the preferences on its side and then can communicate that over to the OpenID Connect server. So in this way, it will start to make the two look like one. So another way of doing that might be if you store the locale in a cookie on the OpenID Connect server. You could also have a default setting there in the OpenID Connect server. You could also use the browser settings, so they're sending up there and they accept language. You could also have a drop down on the consent page, so maybe they change it, like I arrive here and it's in Swedish and I want to switch it to English. You could do those sort of things. But the important part is that this information is presented in a language that they can understand so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to release this data. Another important part is that you provide more information about the application and the terms and the policies of releasing that information and using that application. So every application will have different terms of service, different privacy policy, especially if those applications are third-party providers that are delivering them. So you want to have a link there where the user can find out about them, and also the contact information so that they can reach out to them before consenting. Another part that I won't dwell on, which is maybe obvious, is that the user needs to have a way of canceling that. And according to good user experience, you probably want to mute that or de-emphasize that, but always give the user the option to say, no, I don't consent to this release of data. Another thing you want to make sure that your OpenID Connect server can do is to force consent or reconsent. So back in May, we want to all reconsent to all access to all data. Because GDPR is going into effect. And that could also happen again in the future, like maybe your privacy policy changes, so you want to ask the user to reconsent to everything. So you want to have a way of doing that, and OpenID Connect actually specifies exactly how to do that. We have this prompt equals consent, and it's sort of like a forced consent at that point. So the application knows I need to have this happen and can communicate that to the OpenID Connect server just using a simple query string parameter. Also in the Security Identity server, we have this consent allow deselection. So if, based on runtime behavior or context, you can see that, yes, the user can deselect these certain claims, you can provide that query string parameter, and you can provide both of them in the same request even. So think about forced consent and reconsent in your OpenID implementation. Another thing I want to point out is that some clients are registering in a dynamic fashion. So beforehand, without an administrator that works for you or on your behalf, a client is actually going to register within your OpenID Connect server. So rather than going into some sort of administrative website on the back end and configuring stuff, they're making an API call to get a new relying party application registered in your OpenID Connect server. These dynamic clients pose a bit more security risk because they're a little more hands distance or arm's distance away from you. So you need to make sure that when registering them, the URLs that they're registering are valid, right? So what if the privacy policy of that dynamic client was Google's? What if the logo was Google's logo? What if but the redirect URI was to the baddies website or application. So you want to do some checks on those URLs and privacy policies, terms of service that they're registering to make sure that they're in control of those and that the redirect URIs are matching. Otherwise, the consent screen that's being shown could actually impersonate a different application or organization. You also may want to do some checks to make sure that the name of the client is registered, so you don't just show this GUID that's just completely opaque, but an actual name that the user can relate to and know before they make a consent of that dynamic application receiving their data. You could also enforce rules to say that the description should be there, contact information should be available. You also probably want to show in the consent that this is a more distant application. So maybe instead of a green icon, maybe a yellow icon, like check this a little more carefully. You also want to make sure to display in that consent screen maybe the full URLs so that it's not just a privacy policy as text, but when you click that, this is where you're going, so the user can make a more informed decision about allowing access for this dynamic client. Next thing I want to talk to you about that will help you to meet GDPR and to create privacy-aware implementations of identity is something called Pairwise Pseudonymous identifiers. And this is a different identifier per client application. So a PPID is an unguessable user ID. You can't figure it out. You can't predict it. It's completely random. And the pairwise part comes from the fact that there's no tracking or relationship between the user ID that the user logs in with and the one that is given, and the one that is given is per client application. So it's a pairing of the user and the client application. And the ID is completely unrelated, but the applications sometimes want to be working together in cahoots, so we need a way of actually grouping clients together. So let me show you how that works. So the basic flow is this. We have some user named Alice. User is accessing some application like Cloud App 1, and a completely random, unguessable PPID is provided to that application. When Alice accesses a different client application, www1, a different, completely unguessable and unrelated identifier is given to this application. So these two cannot share information and figure out what's going on at Alice and build up a larger profile of her. But as I said, sometimes client applications do need to work together, so we can group them by something called sectors. And what happens with a sector is that you can say that these two applications are in the same group and will receive the same PPID. They still don't receive Alice's actual user ID, so it's still synonymous, but they can at least work together and save profile data within their sector. This application is still receiving a different user ID because it's not within that sector. An important part on the dynamic clients, which again impose different security requirements, is that we need to make sure that clients don't dynamically try to get into a different sector or a sector of an application that they're trying to attack or gain privacy information from. So during the validation, when we make the request, part of the registration request is different redirect URIs. And if there are multiple redirect URIs here with different host portions, then there needs to be a validation check to make sure that the application can join that sector, and it's done using the sector identifier URI. And the OpenID Connect server will call out to that sector identifier. It needs to be returned a JSON array, including all of the URIs that were included in the redirect URI request. And if that's the case, then this application will be able to join that sector dynamically. The last thing I want to talk to you about in the few minutes I have that you can use to help fulfill GDPR and create more private APIs and identity systems is something called phantom tokens. These are privacy-preserving pattern that you can use in access token issuance and validation. So the basic idea with OpenID Connect and OAuth is like this. The application here will redirect the user to the OpenID Connect provider, log in like we saw, probably consent as we discussed, and then issue a token to the application. The application will then call the API with that token. Okay? So in this case, both the client application and the website are regulated because this token contains personally identifiable information. So what we can do instead, though, is we can use a phantom token approach, because usually when APIs are deployed, like we just heard about, there's some sort of reverse proxy or API gateway in the middle here. So when the application thinks it's calling the APIs, it's really calling, first of all, the API gateway. So what it can do is it can switch a token, which is a by reference token, or an opaque GUID that refers to the identity data to the OpenID Connect server, and that can return a by value token that includes all of the identity information and is forwarded to the backend. So as a consequence, this token here contains no PII, no personally identifiable information. That's only provided on the backend after the token has been validated. That's the phantom token pattern. There are many benefits to this. One is that we have a smaller regulated space. Everything outside, beyond the reverse proxy, doesn't have access to PII, so it's no longer in a regulated space. Only those back-end APIs are. It's also not possible for the client applications to start using the PII within those tokens. If they were by value JSON web tokens, for example, the mobile app might start picking out little parts of that JSON token and using it for its own benefit. And later, when the API wants to remove things or add things, it might break the front end. So we have the benefit of regulation, simplicity, and also less dependencies. And we also make sure that the inputs here, like the token, no matter how long you pound on it or interrogate it, you can never find the PII, because one of the alternatives is just to return an encrypted token. But an encrypted token is putting the decryption input into the hands of the attackers and saying, I dare you to attack it and decrypt it. And if you can succeed in that, you'll gain the PII. So by using a reference token instead, which is completely opaque and can't be reversed to the identity data, we are not daring the attacker to attack us in that way. It's also standard compliant. Both all of these different flows, like this one here, is using something called introspection, which is a related OAuth and OpenID Connect standard. It could also use token exchange. And as a consequence, it's vendor neutral, this pattern. Drawbacks, we have the network dereferencing, that sideways call to the OpenID Connect server as we flow into the network. We can fix this by caching the responses. These GUIDs are globally unique, so they can live across our entire API space. So even if you're calling multiple APIs with the same token, they can always be decached to the same values. We also can preemptively populate that cache, and we can use a fast reverse proxy. So this is not a real problem. The alternatives is that we use a by-value JSON web token that doesn't include any PII, but once you need that identity data, you'll have to dereference it anyway, so it's not really a very good alternative. So in summary, to help you meet GDPR, make sure and provide good user consent screens using those tips that I gave you. Don't show the actual user ID, but mask that using a PPID, and use the phantom token pattern to reduce the regulated space that you have in your APIs. Thank you very much.